Good morning, everybody. It's good to have such a buzzy crowd at 8:30 in the morning. So welcome to the launch of this new Institute for Government report, Taking Back Control of Trade Policy. Of course, although we all know Brexit means Brexit, one of the things Brexit definitely does mean is that for the first time in probably 2 generations of civil service, we have to take control of trade policy and do things that the EU has been doing for us, for ourselves. And that's what the new report that we're launching today, where the bulk of the work has been done by Oliver Ilott, with a lot of help from Ines Stelk when she was an intern here, and a little bit of input from me, she said, justifying my name on it. But anyway, so we are launching our new report today, which is looking at how does government, and that means both civil service and ministers, need to get ready to take advantage of the opportunities and manage the risks that come when we start to operate our own independent trade policy after Brexit. So what we're going to do is hear from the report's lead author, Oliver Ilott, a senior researcher here. Oliver's going to present some headlines from his report, but could I just recommend that you do actually read the full thing, available online. We've pulled out the key messages for you in the handout. We're then going to have comments from 3 different perspectives. There was a commented around table that we ran with the City of London a few weeks ago, where people said if you hadn't been doing trade on June 23rd, you shouldn't really be talking about trade now. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined by 3 people who were thinking about trade policy before June 23rd, 2016. So I'm delighted that on my left I have the High Commissioner from Singapore, Ms. Hsia, who is going to give us a sort of perspective from a country that everybody, I think, recognises very successful in managing and running its own trade policy. Then we're going to go to Allie Renison. Allie is the head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors and has worked on trade and European issues at a number of institutions. And finally, delighted to have Stephen Adam from Global Counsel. And Stephen has also advised globally on trade issues, but also been an advisor to DG Trade. So they're going to give us perspectives, but then we're going to have a sort of big chance for you to ask questions, make comments, etc., etc. Civil servants in the room, remember this is being live streamed and on the record, so be very careful in anything you say, apply your normal diplomatic skills, whatever. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Oliver Ilott. And if you want to tweet, we're using the hashtag IFGBrexit, so do tweet away and join the conversation on Twitter. Oliver.
Thank you very much, Jill. And thank you all for coming. I imagine that this is one of the last places left in the country where you can have a free croissant and coffee without hearing the words strong and stable in return. So, as Jill says, the thinking behind this report is that trade is not something that the UK has really done for the last 40 years. In that long ago time, before the referendum, there were just 50 people in government working on trade. And so the Institute for Government's question is, well, how do we build this into what we need post-Brexit, which is an independent trade department and an independent trade policy? The report that we're publishing today, is that coming back? Yeah. The report that we're publishing today, which is online, and if you can't find it on our website, I have just tweeted it, is based on 25 interviews that we did with current and former trade negotiators based in the US, Canada, the EU, Australia, and New Zealand. It's not, I should say, a report about our trading relationship with the EU, although there is a section in the report if that's what you're after. Instead, what we're focusing on is the answer to 2 questions. The first is, how do we build this machine in Whitehall? What does it look like to have a government capability to pursue your own independent trade policy? And the second question is that once you have that machine up and running, what do you do with it? Now, I'm going to condense this. You've got 9 messages in your handout. There are 60 pages to the report. I'm going to give you 6 points. So this is the briefest possible summation of what we've been doing. And on the first issue, how we build a trade machine, I'm going to talk about the need for specialist negotiators. I should say specialist brackets, not generalist. For cross-government collaboration and on openness. And on what we do with it, I'm going to talk about the need to prioritize, to look beyond free trade agreements, and to mesh with domestic policy. So, let's start by talking about specialist negotiators. not everybody who works in a trade department is a trade negotiator. There is plenty of scope for people to be doing policy roles, operations, economists, never forgetting the trade lawyers. If any of you know a trade lawyer, they are in giddy mood at the moment. But you do need some trade negotiators, people who can actually sit in the room opposite their counterparts across the negotiating table. And those trade negotiators, well, technical expertise is not enough. Just because they know about how intellectual property works doesn't mean they can negotiate the relevant agreement. What they need, of course, is specific negotiating skill. The skill, the ability to anchor the conversation and frame issues in a way that gives them the upper hand. And that skill is very difficult to teach in the classroom. That skill is born of experience. And so if you ask this Canadian chief negotiator or former chief negotiator what they wanted in their team, they'll tell you that the training can be useful, but what they're really looking for is experience. And this is a challenge to Whitehall's normal way of doing things, because what it means is that you can't staff your trade negotiators with generalists. You can't move people into this role for 2 or 3 years, have them pick up the necessary technical expertise, and then move them on after 2 or 3 years. If that's the approach that we take to our trade negotiators, we're never going to build the necessary experience, and we're going to be eaten for breakfast. The solution is to do a carve-out within the civil service, to have a dedicated core of trade negotiators, people who expect to have a career building up this necessary expertise. There are civil service functions, professions, specialisms. We've got some recommendations in the report about how you build one of these for trade negotiators. There was a little clue that the civil service is heading in this direction. If you look at the job advert that was put out for the UK's chief negotiator, it suggests that there will be this kind of profession, but that hasn't led to anything yet, and we need to see it do so. My second point is about cross-government collaboration. So just because you make a department for international trade does not mean that any one department can do international trade. Trade is going to be inherently cross-government. And to demonstrate that, let's consider what it would look like for the UK to do its own trade deal. Let's consider what it would have looked like for the UK to do this trade deal, which is the EU's trade deal with Canada. This would have been led by the Department for International Trade. But Chapter 7, subsection E on financial services would have required input from the Treasury. Similarly, Annex 2D on pharmaceutical products, the Department of Health. Similarly, Chapter 7, subsection D on telecommunication services, DCMS. You can see where this is going. Chapter 5 on plant and animal health, DEFRA. Chapter 9 on government procurement, the Cabinet Office. And Chapter 10 on intellectual property, the Business Department. And this goes all the way through. And what this means is that the trade is going to be inherently cross-government. And the consequence is that when we ask, is the UK ready to do trade deals? Is it ready to pursue its own independent trade policy? We cannot answer that question based simply on the capacity in DIT. It needs to be based on the extent to which other government departments are up and running. Now, after the referendum, DIT moved very quickly, I'd say, to build up its staff. Treasury and DEFRA moved quickly to build on existing trade teams. DCMS and BEIS moved a little bit more slowly, and a department like Department of Health is moving slower still. And the UK will negotiate as a convoy, moving at the speed of its slowest partner. And if some of those departments haven't even left port yet, we certainly aren't ready to negotiate. But the second thing that the cross-government nature of trade means is that with all of these departmental interests come political interests, come ministerial interests. And we will reach a point where we have to say to DEFRA that it is not going to get its way on plant and animal health so that we can get our way somewhere else, say on the intellectual property chapter. And the interviews that we conducted for this report leave me in no doubt that Liam Fox will spend as much time negotiating with his colleagues around the cabinet table as he will with dignitaries from other countries. And my third point on the machine that we need to assemble for this is about openness. And this is openness not from the perspective of what government has an obligation to do. It's openness in terms of how you can be effective in making trade policy. Government makes trade deals, but it's businesses that trade, it's consumers that consumes, it's environmental groups and businesses and labour unions that are affected by the regulations introduced by it. And what that means is that these groups will engage with the process. That is inevitable. What you need to avoid is that you do it badly. What you need to avoid is falling into the trap of this Australian negotiator who found suddenly that all of the ministers' sailing buddies were the CEOs of precisely those firms that they were about to open up to international competition. And so they would come back from a weekend of sailing and find that all of that briefing had disappeared. Now, of course, this would never happen in the UK. But if we're to be absolutely sure of that, we need to be much more proactive in terms of how we think about how we're going to engage these groups. So in the first instance, let's set up a structure for it. In the interviews that we conducted, there was a bit of a split. Some countries do their business and other group engagement on a kind of ad hoc basis. They have the people's numbers and they know who to call. Some countries have standing business committees, and Canada has had both. And that seems to be the more effective model. So you set up standing advisory committees with businesses and other groups, NGOs, charities and so on, they're going to be affected by this. Each group focusing on different specific trade issues. And they advise you on FTAs and other trade issues. Of course, that needs to go beyond business to avoid capture, and also so that you don't get ambushed by non-business groups when you do announce a trade deal at the end of it. But perhaps most controversially, you need to give them access. They can't, what's going to matter in these trade deals is where the comma is placed, and they can't give you that advice on a nudge and a wink about what's inside the trade deal. And countries that don't give businesses access to the texts as they are negotiating them find, like Australia, this is a report from an Australian parliamentary committee, that they couldn't do high quality consultation simply because they didn't have that level of access. This again is a challenge to Whitehall. This level of permeability of being able to involve outsiders collaboratively in what you're doing is not necessarily how Whitehall always works. But the risk if you don't do it is that you end up doing a deal that no one wants to use. So the Australia-US deal, over half of eligible Australian business ignores that deal entirely, simply because it has to jump through too many hoops. And you can follow that thread through and ask, well, if they had more, say, in sculpting it, would that have been the case? So those are my messages on how we build a machine. Specialist negotiators, cross-government collaboration, and a degree of openness is necessary for effectiveness. Once you've built it, what do you do with it? So my first point here is to prioritize. One of the real risks for the UK, is that at some point a document circulates inside number 10 or inside the Department for International Trade that looks something like this. It would probably be typed. And you can see the Institute has really splashed out on my graphics budget for this presentation. This is the last thing that the UK needs. Starting a trade negotiation is the easiest thing to do in trade. Not only is starting a negotiation easy, but it comes with excellent photo opportunities. I say excellent, I'd say poor to middling photo opportunities. Nevertheless, if you're a trade minister, you don't get many of them. But just because you start a trade negotiation doesn't mean that you'll conclude one. And if you don't conclude it, there is no benefit derived whatsoever, and it just sucks up resources. So these photo opportunities are actually taken from negotiations that are still going on, and have been going on for 7 years, 22 years, and 27 years, respectively. The eagle-eyed among you will spot there have been a couple of hiatuses in these latter two, but that doesn't disrupt the point. And so if the UK races into a situation in which it initiates as many trade deals as it can, it will find that it falls into this trap, the trap of this former chief negotiator, who found that they were doing so many trade deals at once that they couldn't service any of them sufficiently to bring them to conclusion. The department was overworked on the negotiating side. They actually outsourced their policy-making function to the academic community because there was no one left in the department to do that thinking. And it is plausible and worrying that the UK could end up in that position, that we leap into this, what we think is leaping into it with both feet, and find that we are negotiating a dozen or 2 dozen deals at once, and that we simply cannot bring any of them to conclusion, and after 4 or 5 years we have to reset the strategy and focus. So to avoid that, let's prioritize now. And who should we prioritize? Well, there's quite a lot about this in the report, but what I'm going to pick out now is the need to prioritize the existing EU free trade agreements. So the EU has around 50 of these agreements. They will not carry over to the UK automatically on Brexit. They will to some extent have to be renegotiated. Which ones do we focus on? Well, if you map the UK's, those 23 countries to which the UK has more than £1 billion worth of exports, and size of exports along the bottom, and map it against the average tariffs of those countries coming up the side, in pink are those countries with which the EU already has an agreement. And if we remove some of the clutter from this, what leaps out are 5 deals where the EU has a deal, the country is worth more than £4 billion worth of exports to us, and in the example of Korea, we might revert to an average tariff of as much as 9%. CHE is Switzerland, I should say. And these need to be our priority for the next few years. And so we need to bear that in mind before we start having conversations about the US, China, India, because the gains from those deals, brand new deals, are hypothetical. The losses from foregoing these deals are assured. So we need to prioritize. My fifth point is about the need to look beyond FTAs, and I have been guilty in the presentation so far of not doing this. But there are plenty more options in the toolbox than just doing a trade deal. And if trade is reduced to deals, we'll miss out on those opportunities. So really, we should begin everything with the question of what are you trying to achieve? What problem are you trying to solve? And if we ask ourselves that question, we might find that things like commercial diplomacy, targeted negotiations for specific issues, or unilateral policy actions are what get us there. If we solve every problem with a free trade agreement, it's going to be sledgehammers cracking nuts, only the sledgehammers might take 7 years to get to the nut. So let's avoid, in our discussion of trade, devolving it into this question of deals. And my last point is on the need to mesh with domestic policy. Because fundamentally, whatever we do in the Department for International Trade, it's our education policy, our tax policy, our labour policy that's going to have the bigger impact on trade performance. And that's demonstrated if you compare a country like France and Germany. France and Germany share a trade department, DG Trade in Brussels. They have all of the same trade deals, they have the same currency, and one runs a deficit, trade deficit, 1% of GDP, and one runs a trade surplus, 9% of GDP. What makes the difference is their domestic policy. And the challenge for the UK is, can it develop a trade strategy that links into its wider economic strategy? And that isn't just an intellectual challenge, it's actually, I guess this is a classic IFG line on this, it's also a mechanism of government challenge. How do you do the drafting? And actually I think the analogue there is the national security strategy. From its headline, you would expect the national security strategy to be targeted mainly at the Ministry of Defence, but there are actions in there for other government departments as well, and it's a cross-government look. If the Ministry of Defence were to hold the pen in authoring this defence strategy, counterintuitively, it might find it harder to get buy-in from other departments. Instead, the Cabinet Office is responsible for coordinating this process because the Prime Minister can stand right behind it and compel other people to get involved. And so my last message is that when the UK gets round to producing a trade strategy, let's ask whether DIT is the right person actually to be drafting that strategy. If we want it to be incorporated into domestic policy effectively, it may be more, we may get further if it's Cabinet Office that actually holds the pen, even if that's a slightly challenging message. So here are my points. We need specialist negotiators, cross-government collaboration, openness, and then to prioritise, to look beyond FTAs, and to mesh with domestic policy. And I'll finish by saying that I think the Department for International Trade has done a really impressive amount of work since the referendum and has built capacity very quickly. But this is the crucial juncture. This is the moment where we ask, are we going to run trade the way we run everything else, as a closed operation with generalists, or are we going to recognise the distinctiveness of trade? And it's the moment when we need to move our discussion of trade beyond the level it is at the moment. We need to prioritise and to look beyond FTA and to recognise the link with domestic policy. Because if we don't do that, we'll fluff this.
Okay, thank you very much, Oliver. So that was just a sort of skating across the surface of what is a sort of very detailed piece of research. But before we open it up to questions, we're going to, as I said, hear three perspectives from different points of view about different parts of the report. I'm going to start with High Commissioner from Singapore, giving some perspectives from a country that, as I said, has been doing this independently and well for a long time. High Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Oliver, for the excellent report. As you could tell, Singapore was not formally consulted in the preparation of this report, probably because we are in quite different circumstances and many of what we have done might not be completely relevant to the UK. But I was glad I had, because of my involvement in this panel, to have that discussion with Oliver and just give a little bit of comparisons and inputs before the finalization of the report. And Oliver in his presentation, as well as the finalization of the report, have provided excellent recommendations on the process and institutions, on the capacity, and we cannot more highly commend it. But from my perspective, I just wanted to touch on 3 points. The first point is somewhat topical because the European Court of Justice has just come up with its decision on the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. There is a mixed competency agreement and what that means, including for Brexit negotiations. The second point would be perhaps slightly micro and self-interested because you will be talking about Singapore and what that means. And hopefully that will lead to a much larger point on the overall strategy that the intergovernmental process, including all your relevant stakeholders, should really think about. So on the first topical point on the European Court of Justice decision, I think everybody should read the front page article that quoted Allie on the Financial Times that gave, I believe, an accurate, and of course we still need to study a bit further, but an accurate categorization that it is in fact a good decision, it's not a bad decision. Because there was some perception that because it has decided on mixed competency, which requires ratification by all national and regional parliaments, this would spell trouble. But on the contrary, the European Court of Justice has decided on areas of competency that were even broader than what the Advocate General had propagated. So it's very clear that a large part of the agreement, except 2 areas, which is on the non-direct investment or portfolio investment, and equally critically the issue of investment-state dispute mechanism, falls under national and regional parliament for ratification, but the bulk of it, including on areas like environment, on transport, that was not so clear-cut, is now clearly under Commission's competency. Which means in the case of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, once it goes through the proper process, a large part of the agreement could be provisionally applied. And that is particularly significant for the UK because you are in the process of exiting the EU. And within this 2-year time frame, if these provisions can be provisionally applied, which means it's also applied here in the UK, they can be benefited by the businesses, your businesses, and then we can look into the subsequent arrangement after Brexit, but at least we have a baseline from which to further discuss. And the significance of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement is not just about the Singapore market, which is not that significant, but not to be sneezed at either. But the more important part of it is really that it's a pathway, it's a pathfinder to a much larger market, which people sometimes forget. When you look at Asia, you always look at China, India, 2 huge and growing economies. But what should not be forgotten is ASEAN, the 10 countries from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Collectively, the economy is $2.4 trillion, which is larger than India. We have 630 million in the association, which is larger than the European Union. It's growing above 5%, which is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. The demographic is young, which means that there is a growing middle class that is hungry and willing to join the consumer class. So huge opportunities that should not be missed, which means that this ability to use Singapore as the gateway to Southeast Asia is very significant, that should not be ignored. So from that perspective, looking into what the arrangements that need to preserve that Oliver spoke about, since there is an EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, is in the list of priorities that Oliver suggested you should look into. I think the same idea about the fact that half your investment into Southeast Asia goes through Singapore. There are more, for example, US investment in ASEAN, and a bulk of them go through Singapore, than India, China, and Japan combined. Which means that, and ASEAN collectively also attracts more investment than China in the last few years, is something that you really ought to look into. And one of the other suggestion that Oliver made is that in order to acquire the experience to do much more complicated and larger trade negotiations, is that you start with smaller, like-minded countries. And from Singapore's perspective, if you look at the chart that he showed, we have about 5 billion of bilateral trade, 0 tariff actually for Singapore, which means that there's not a lot to negotiate. There's no sensitive areas on areas like agriculture, which means that it ought to be a fairly straightforward negotiation. It's an easy win, it's a quick win, but it's also one in which you then can acquire the experience and exchange the respective expertise to do and to go into much larger and perhaps more complicated negotiations. Then my final point really is about strategy. I think this whole issue about having an intergovernmental process with cabinet level supervision, including different stakeholders, are extremely important. And you could really do a matrix in terms of trade figures. What are you losing? What are you gaining? What are your offensive, defensive interests? But what I would suggest that UK also think about, in that you have aspiration, of course you are a very major player in the world, is that you need to think broader about what is UK's role when you talk about global Britain. Just again, to take an example from Singapore's perspective, we have, of course, a range of bilateral arrangements. We have regional arrangements that is ASEAN-centric together with our major trading partners in Asia. We have what is now the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being looked into whether we can have a Trans-Pacific Partnership without the US with the existing 11 members. And these huge plurilateral arrangements are extremely critical in what I would consider a jigsaw puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle of what the global trading rules, what the trading system, which in our view ought to remain open, liberal, and rules-based, ought to be. And the more like-minded countries can form big chunks of this jigsaw puzzle that we are trying to fill, and then the smaller pieces can then be put together, the easier it is for all of us who believe in global trade to complete the picture of the Doha round. We could have a completely different picture that could be led by a different chunk of countries. So if you want to be part of, and now that you are so-called liberated from the European Union to be able to play that role, you need to think seriously about the ability to form larger coalitions, to lead the way beyond just the very short-term prioritization of small free trade agreements that you are hoping to prioritize and enter into. That's what I have to say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting challenge, just placed there about the sort of role we can play longer term in shaping future world trading arrangements. We've talked a lot about the role of government, but one of the things that really matters as well is the business side of things. Oliver mentioned that a bit. So just as the UK government hasn't had to focus on trade, so businesses here have been looking to Brussels rather than to Whitehall to do it. So can I ask Allie Renison from the Institute Directors to talk about business and how business needs to prioritise and engage? Allie.
Thank you very much for having me. I think one of the actually unfortunate things about this discussion is so much of it is coloured by Brexit, and that means that we all know that trade is political in the first instance to begin with, but you have people on both sides. The Department of International Trade and specifically the Secretary of State is under immense pressure to some extent from I hate to sort of categorize people still into this leave or remain side, but people who were kind of on the leave side who sort of are saying that they are gauging the success of Brexit by how many trade deals we can do right away, and then you also have people who were on the remain side who were quite critical of this idea that we can go off and do lots of trade agreements. So they too are kind of holding up the department through this metric of how many agreements we can do at speed to point out that actually it's a failure. So you have this sort of this context in which the department's under huge pressure to deliver a lot, and it's not very politically expedient to say, hang on, we're going through a period of consultation, stakeholder engagement. I've heard someone describe it as paralysis by analysis. Well, I think actually this 2-year period is going to be very, very instrumental in putting together what those strategy priorities, the overarching framework is, but that's not a very sexy message to sell at a political level. So you have the Prime Minister going over to Washington, D.C. and coming back and talking about having laid the foundations for a trade deal with the U.S., and then you speak to civil servants who have no idea, they're not really on the same page. So it's a little bit confusing, and I think the business community is certainly confused for a variety of different reasons. One, most of them haven't really thought about this that much, and if there are trade associations who have people who are, they are in Brussels. They will stay there. They will probably be, as the sort of the interest in this ramps up, coming back. But it's really interesting, I think, and having been in some of the room where you know, you have people from all different sectors coming in to sort of just start trying to put all this stuff together from the business community, you start to see these debates that are about to emerge, which I'm actually a little bit nervous about. You know, I think people are really looking forward to having the debate itself about, you know, not just with respect to trade policy, how do you organize your agricultural support system, but I think that we've taken for granted in this country that, you know, the UK always talks about itself being an open and liberal and sort of outward-looking country. And I got a taste for it when I was sort of working a lot on TTIP, for whether that was because, you know, some groups were able to speak particularly loudly and how reflective they were of the wider public opinion towards trade, I'm not sure. But there was a lot of antipathy towards TTIP, you know, trade unions handing out leaflets in sort of tube stations, etc. So I think that we have, I don't want to say fooled ourselves into thinking that this is going to be huge public appetite for this. I think it will, the fact that Brexit is happening will maybe buy the UK some time, in the sense that you know, if despite the fact that you have a lot of constituencies that are sometimes captured by certain parts of the media who will be reticent about the concept of doing a deal with America as quickly as possible and opening ourselves up to, you know, the story chlorinated chicken, etc. I think that there are certain aspects of the media that are so pro-Brexit and therefore won't necessarily get caught up in that diatribe. So maybe that will keep some of that at bay to a certain extent. And I think that that means that we have an opportunity to try and figure out how we want to communicate with people beyond the business community as well, to try and make these arguments. And I think that the investment sort of aspect, well, particularly dispute settlement, I think that that will provide some food for thought about how we want to include that in trade deals or not, for example, because I think one of the problems with having ISDS in trade agreements is that it allows, and this isn't a reason not to do it necessarily, but it allowed people who were kind of quite anti-globalization to moonlight behind their opposition to ISDS, and that became the sort of the focal point. And I think sometimes maybe if that's removed, it makes it a little bit easier to try and figure out, you know, who are the people who are actually not so supportive of the idea of trade liberalization, etc. I mentioned that the business community is confused, one, because a lot of people haven't been thinking about this for so long, two, because I think there's a confusion about the sort of trade of direction, in the sense that, you know, for example, we don't know what's going on with TTIP at the moment. There are quite a few business organizations who have been putting all of their stock, including ourselves, the IOD, into that. And, you know, we've had the EU Trade Commissioner saying that it's kind of on ice, which was remarkable for me. And even though I think that we all knew that, generally speaking, and then after the presidential election, I was quite struck by how blunt she was about it. But I think a lot of people who were sort of focused on the USEU trade agreement are a bit confused now about, well, if we're going to be doing a trade agreement with the US, which basket are we putting our eggs into? Because I don't want to be looking at two different trade agreements at the same time.
Or EU.
UK or EU. And I think that that will eventually, I think at the moment the government is kind of tiptoeing around talking about, you know, at what point is there going to be a, for lack of a better word, cutoff date to which ongoing or recently concluding EU trade agreements do not apply to the UK. I think that some people don't necessarily want to raise that, because maybe there's some work that can be done, including on either converting, you can use the word of your choice, converting, renegotiating existing EU FTAs. I do absolutely agree that I think the priority, without a shadow of a doubt, is Turkey, Switzerland, Israel as well, but the people with whom we already have existing trade agreements. But again, that's a hard message to sell, because it's not a brand new sort of shiny trade agreement with a new country. So I think that the business kind of needs a steer from government on that to a certain extent. On the transparency question, it's interesting, because I've never really, I think I understand the need as sort of on an iterative basis for a relative degree of secrecy, but I think, and I'm not sure if it's because, and you'll hear from my accent, I grew up in the US, I remember going to stakeholder rounds and talking to the trade negotiators there, the US trade negotiators, and they were just kind of monotonously in tone about the need for secrecy, and they didn't really give much away. And it wasn't clear to me whether that's because they just don't face the same level of concentrated opposition that the European Commission faced. I do think that the EU Commission has done an incredible job without revealing completely its hands, although you have WikiLeaks doing it anyways to a certain extent, in sort of moving to respond to public concern. I know some people don't think that they should have sort of jumped in that respect, but I think that that will hopefully set a framework for a slightly more transparent approach to. There's so much that you can do with respect to publishing fact sheets. You don't have to go into every single textual detail, but it was extremely helpful for myself because I think there's this assumption that business is going to be instinctively by default perhaps supportive of the idea of free trade agreements, which they are, but then as you get on and you look at the degree of which US trade organizations are able to really, I mean, I think that they probably obviously carry more weight with the government, but they're much more vocal than the NGO community in terms of making their concerns and sort of protected interest known. So I mean, I think there will have to be a formalized structure, and at the minute we're looking, and the report is very helpful in that respect. We're trying to look at not to copy a model, but look at sort of the practice. Obviously, during TTIP, it was there was kind of a group that met after every round. It didn't just include business, although sometimes we would have individual sessions, but. So I'm not convinced of the best way forward for a formalized structure. I do think there needs to be one, and I think that's again sort of shows the benefit of the next 2 years is being able to sort all of those things out. And then just quickly on the civil service, which I'm probably not necessarily the best place to speak about. I do know that the people, and some of them in this room, so I'm not going to look at them, but there are incredible people who were working on TTIP who are now in DIT. I absolutely agree that this needs to be a cross-Whitehall effort. The idea of putting it, I mean, it depends sort of the lead in the cabinet office. I mean, if you have the cabinet office sort of leading it and sort of leading the charge for doing a trade agreement, but sort of the people who are actually working on DIT aren't sure about what's going on.
We think they should take the lead in writing the strategy, which is different from actually leading the deals and the negotiations. That would be very clearly a DIT lead. Yeah.
It's just not clear to me at the moment, the structure that the people to me, there's more actually people who have been put in the post they need to be in DIT than there are in the cabinet office, but I don't work in the cabinet office, so I can't say that completely authoritatively. And I think just to close, it's really important to stress this message that Oliver was talking about, is not gauging the success of the department by trade deals. Not only is there so much that you can do, I saw that the Secretary of State got criticism for announcing deals, commercial deals. That still counts as trade deals, but I think, obviously it's conflated, so you get people arguing about whether it counts as a trade deal or not. There is so much that can be done bilaterally. At the moment, the U.S. drug, I think it's the FTA and DEFRA here have been basically trying to work out an agreement on lifting the import restrictions on Irish and UK beef. These are bilateral wins that you can continue to pursue, and I think those will become even more important to show the progress I think that we're doing in the short term.
Thank you, Allie. That's a great cue, I think, for Stephen to talk about actually what does a good trade strategy look like, and what are the other components beyond free trade agreements. Stephen.
Okay. Well, a lot of ground's already been covered, so I'm not quite sure what's left for me to comment on.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a great report. There's a lot in it that I agree with. There's a few things I would amplify, I guess. I mean, I think the guys are absolutely right to identify and stress the fact that trade and trade policy needs to be seen as an ecosystem that needs nurturing and not just a succession of bilateral deals. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, the first and probably the most important is that trade deals are good at certain things and they're bad at other things. And one of the reasons they tend to be bad at things is precisely because they are deals. They are based on the trading of concessions. And that's an inherently political process. It's inherently complex. It tends to be the reason why FTAs stall and under-deliver. And we are always, I think, at risk of miscalculating what is going to be tractable via those kinds of concession-based, mutual concession-based agreements. And in fact, if you look at the last 30 years and you assess where the new market opportunity has come for UK businesses, especially in Southeast Asia, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, it has never come from a bilateral trade agreement. Fundamentally, actually, where it's come from is unilateral reform in our trading partners. And that's a really tricky question, because that actually suggests that one of the challenges for a trade policy, as well as Oliver's point of going back to the very beginning and asking the question, what do we actually want to achieve? One of the tricky questions is not whether you can strike multilateral deals, plurilateral deals, or bilateral deals. It's how you can encourage unilateral reform in our trading partners in other parts of the world. And as I say, we should never lose sight of the fact that the thing that actually has materially made the biggest difference in almost all of our trading partners over the last 20 years has been those trading partners' governments, as the result of a domestic internal process, deciding to liberalize their market, reform the way they operate, create new access for foreign businesses for their own reasons and on their own terms. So that's a tricky one, but I think it's one we need to think about. And I think it comes back to Oliver's point about seeing trade policy as essentially a wider diplomatic process. It's about the diplomatic relationships between our policymakers, it's about the diplomatic relations, the commercial diplomacy between our businesses, and it's about the regulatory diplomacy between our regulators. And I think that's crucially important, because one of the other results of 60 years of trade liberalisation since the signing of the GATT is that we are increasingly discovering, at least as long as we stick to the idea that constantly driving liberalisation is a good thing, that the next frontier for trade policy, certainly in developed markets, is in fact regulatory convergence. And unless we are bringing the regulators into the process early on, I mean, Oliver made the point about CETA and the extent to which it implicates domestic regulators. There's a secondary point to that, which is that if the only time you've engaged those regulators is when you've started negotiating those chapters, you've had it in terms of new scope for agreement. If we're not bringing regulators into the process upstream, and this is something that, you know, having watched this being done in Brussels for years, I think is extremely important and tends to easily slip through the cracks. If we're not bringing regulators in upstream, we're limiting the scope, I think, to deepen this conversation and make it one that produces liberalisation. So I think that's really important. And I guess the thing there is, you know, you've got to see trade as more than just deals. A huge amount of what trade policy is commercial diplomacy, it's the operation of a trade defence system, and all the rest of it. And it's implementation as well. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's easy to start a trade deal, it's hard to finish a trade deal. It then can actually be tricky to make it work on the ground. And a lot of that is about making sure your customs authorities know how to implement it, making sure your businesses are aware of it and actually choose to take advantage of it. So let's not lose sight of the implementation piece as well. And I think in that respect, it's important for us to remind ourselves that the definition of trade policy for the UK post-Brexit must extend to the functioning of our customs processing system, because what HMRC does over the next 2 years to prepare this country for shifting from a world in which half of our international trade effectively went to the single market and was therefore free of any form of processing, to one in which all of that trade becomes exports and imports, not dispatches and arrivals, and is therefore subject to processing, is in some respects one of the biggest technical, practical, functional challenges we're going to face with Brexit. So I mean, I would echo all of what and amplify all of what's in the report in that respect. One other observation, which is about politics, and again, this is most of my jobs in trade policy over the years have been advising the politicians who make trade policy. So I mean, I'm not shabby on the technical detail, but a lot of this stuff I think of through the prism of politics. And there's a couple of really great hints in the paper at why this is going to matter, but I think we really need to be clear that not only for the last 30 years has the UK outsourced a lot of the technical practice of trade policy making to Brussels, it's outsourced a lot of the politics of trade policy making to Brussels. We have hidden behind the French on agriculture, we've hidden behind, well, you name it, you all know what I'm talking about. We're about to go through a process of price discovery in the UK where we're going to discover what people actually think about liberalisation. And I think Allie's point about TTIP is a great one. TTIP was launched by a policy-making cadre in London and their political supporters who had no doubt that the UK was absolutely gung-ho for a free trade agreement with the United States, was an outlier in the EU, possibly with the exception of Spain, you know, with respect to support for it. And what did in fact we discover? We actually discovered that the UK political ecosystem was a lot more ambiguous and sceptical about that deal than the official rhetoric would suggest. And we're now about to go through that process in spades. We're going to discover what the British public actually think about reforming farm subsidies. We're going to discover what they think about putting anti-dumping tariffs on Chinese steel the next time something goes wrong in Port Talbot 5 years from now. We're going to discover what they actually think about the UK's remaining tariffs and whether they're in fact just temporarily there until we can get rid of them. And I think one of the things about, again, I take Oliver's point about a cadre of specialists running this stuff. I think it's absolutely right. I think it's one of the reasons why DG Trade, DG Comp are powerful in what they do, but there is a risk to creating a cadre of specialists, which is that, not to put too fine a point on it, they disappear up their own spreadsheets and they become tin-eared with respect to politics. And I would say this actually in a spirit of self-criticism. I look back on my time as a policymaker in Brussels and I have no alternative but to conclude that myself and my colleagues were too intellectually self-confident about some of the data we were basing our judgments on trade liberalisation on, especially the capacity, short-term capacity of societies to adjust. And we were politically too self-confident that ultimately we could push back on domestic producer interests that couldn't see the big picture. And I think 10 years on, we can all see some of the fruits of that slight complacency on the politics. So I think it's incredibly important that while we build a cadre of specialist policymakers in trade in the UK, and actually, although Whitehall doesn't do it, I think some of the economic regulators and the CMA are actually a good example of how we can do career-length specialist roles in the UK civil service. We've got to make sure that when we're training those people, they're not just outsourcing the politics to their ministers, they're politically aware, they are politically, they're conscious of how political what they're doing is, and they're ready to deal with some of the political stuff when it comes down the road and it doesn't trip them up.
I think it's really interesting because I think one of the things we could have called this report, rather than taking back control, is taking back responsibility for trade policy and making all those incredibly difficult choices. Oliver, do you want to come in with any comments on the contributions, and then we'll go to the audience and take some questions?
Yeah, very briefly. So, speaking about a larger coalition and what the UK might look to put together, that larger coalition is just south of our border, and it's called the EU to some extent. That's our regional bloc, and we're leaving the EU, but we aren't leaving Europe. And the trade strategy that the UK proposes, I mean, I'd be very interested in other people's thoughts, but to some extent our trade strategy is always going to be linked to what Europe does. We are Canada to the US, and if you look at what the trade deals that Canada does, quite often they're the US deal 2 years later. And the reason for that, and there's an example in our report of the deal with Morocco, is that when the US signs a deal with someone, it gets a competitive edge, and Canadian businesses start thinking about relocating just south of the border in order to take advantage of that deal. So Canada has to catch up. It's called one of their chief negotiators referred to it as the keeping up with the Joneses trade strategy. Well, we know where our Joneses are. They're 22 miles south of Dover. On the taking it for granted point, I think that's the sort of the politics of this is absolutely how it's going to play out. We all assume at the moment, well, evidently the panel doesn't, that trade is a shiny new toy. It's actually a political hot potato. And the TTIP example is great because if you look at when the Commission put out its consultation on TTIP, you can look at where the responses come from. And 38% of the responses are from the free trade loving UK, more than any other member state. And perhaps some of them were saying, I can't wait for this new trade deal, but I suspect some of them weren't.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the audience and we'll give the members of the panel chances to add in other comments, bring in more of what's in the report. So we've got roving mics with, I think, Rob and Alex. So anyone want to ask a question? Yes, at the back. Alex, behind you.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. I'm Ulrike Hoortop, an independent economist. I wanted to ask you, Oliver, whether you saw any differences in discussions around trade in services versus trade in goods.
Okay, well, let's take that's a good question we haven't touched on. Oliver, do you want to say anything? I might bring in Stephen to talk about services.
Yeah, so I'm going to absolutely gazump what Stephen's about to say, I think, on trade and services, which is this point that, and actually we've got Monique in the audience from NISA, but Monique did a fantastic review of 42 free trade agreements and the impact that they had on bilateral trade between the two countries. And when you look at the impact they had on services trade, it's 0%. There's no impact on having bilateral free trade agreements. And that's why Stephen's point about looking beyond free trade agreements and having that kind of regulatory conversation is the basis for making more progress on services in particular.
Stephen, do you want to come in on services?
Yeah, I guess I would make the one big point, which is that and importing a good and exporting a good, by definition, means making something somewhere albeit in a slightly more complicated way all the time, and sending it to another country. An import comes from somewhere else. When you import a service, almost always in the global economy, you do it via the establishment of a business from that country in your country. And that makes the question of behind-the-border discrimination and the quality of the regulatory environment absolutely key for services trade. And I think it comes back, and it also is one of the reasons, for that reason, why often FTAs struggle in this area. Because often what you want to achieve for your services businesses, especially once you've got past the initial hurdle of can our companies majority own firms in your market, you know, can we, you know, do we have to hire local people for the board, those sorts of market entry kind of hurdles. Once you get past that point, a lot of what makes life better for a UK insurer operating in Japan is what's the quality of the financial services regulation? What's the quality of the transparency of the domestic regulatory and legislative process? How's the court system? How efficient and effective is IP protection? And those things are intractable, broadly speaking, to the FTA mechanism, and they have to be handled by commercial diplomacy and by the encouraging of unilateral reform in those markets broadly.